to Ground Zero Salem. I'm your host, Pat. So, been on kind of a long weekend. I kind of meant to do some videos. I've got a string of days off. Normally I work on Mondays and Tuesdays. Got a couple of days off because I just needed it, you know. Work grinds you down after time, so little mini vacay. But yeah, this weekend I was thinking of doing some videos. Actually started doing these and wasn't really feeling it, you know. But I wanted to continue on with the whole nostalgia trip going year by year. One of the things that I, was a little hesitant about is that I've shown a ton of these before, but just for sake of continuity, I'm going to go back into talking about what I got into in 1990 and 1991. Might run long, I might split them up. We'll just see how it goes. I'm going to shoot from the hip on this one. So we're listening to Trouble, and this came out in 1990. This is the self-titled. Might have to fix that lighting a little bit there. Do that in a moment. Edit accordingly. But this is the self-titled Trouble. It's my favorite. It was recorded in 89, came out in 90. I didn't get into it till mid to late 90s, I think. And that's another thing I wanted to make note of. This isn't talking about specific releases from a specific year, but rather what I was listening to that year. They could have come out years and years before. Just to clarify. Let me see what's up with this light real quick. A nice new LED lamp, you know. This is a harsher white. Make things a little bit clearer for you folks. So one thing that I was, I tried recording these a couple times, and something was missing, and I deleted it, and I figured out that maybe I should show a little bit more of what was going on with me at the time, my interests as a kid, for the sake of autobiographical purposes. And like I said, I was a skateboarder. I was really into it in the late 80s, and up until like 90, 91. Around the time 8th grade rolled around, I got more into music and just kind of stopped skateboarding regularly. And I think it's because, like, if you know anything about the history of skateboarding, the landscape was changing. Into the 90s, street skating became really hot, and tricks got really technical and hard to do, all these kind of flip tricks and stuff. The fashion changed. There was less focus on, like, I don't know, gnarliness and skulls, and more on, like, fucking Cat in the Hat hats and shit. I don't know. Watch Those Who Sold the World, about the rise of world industries. It's a great documentary if you want to check into all that kind of stuff. But I was a skateboarder when I was a really little kid, and I picked it up again off and on over the years. It's a fun thing to do. I've never been good at it. But I thought I'd show off what I was riding. I repurchased this. I don't know. This is a Craig Johnson Alva. I repurchased this 2012 or something like that. For a while, there were a few places online selling new old stock skateboards, and they quickly started selling out when there's an interest in the old school stuff again, and people started wanting to have boards with actual shapes and whatnot. But this is almost the exact same as the one that I had as a kid, although mine had like kind of a sunburst, kind of like a Les Paul or something, that kind of guitar style. This is a different colorway or whatever. But yeah, Baby from Hell. And I remember being really disappointed at the time because the double kick ones were starting to come out. The double nose, where the nose was the same size as the tail. And I have an example of that to show you too. As soon as those got big, these got big. This is a repro of the Vallely Barnyard deck. Mike Vallely, I guess is how you really pronounce his name. I always thought it was Vallely, but this is his own company. He put together and kind of reissued one of his classic designs. This is a re-release of the board. Actually, the original had like a huge nose on it. This actually has a shorter nose in the tail, which I don't remember it being like that back in '89 or whenever it came out. I had to outfit it with some imagery from the era. This is the Coma of Souls creator mascot. I've always been a fan of clear grip tape. And we got, like, I don't know if you can see that. That's the King Horse album art there. Now, musically, going into 7th grade, throughout 6th grade into 7th grade, I actually kind of dialed it back a little bit. I was really into AC/DC that year. I don't know, I just discovered them, and they completely won me over. I don't know what it was. I was already listening to far more aggressive stuff, like I said last update. really into Anthrax and Nuclear Assault, and you know, a few others. And for whatever reason, I came across the Who Made Who tape, which is like kind of a best of, and loved that stuff. And then this came out in 1990. This is the Razor's Edge. I think it came out the summer between 6th and 7th grade, if I'm not mistaken, for me. And the video for Thunderstruck was all over MTV. It was inescapable. Mistress for Christmas was another hit a little bit later down the line, another single. And this was kind of my impetus to get into that, and Who Made Who were my impetus to get into the earlier stuff, the Bon Scott stuff. Of course, Back in Black was great. I did, even back then, like, I didn't really care for the ones that came out after For Those About to Rock. It just didn't really do, those records didn't really do anything for me, like Flick of the Switch and Fly on the Wall and stuff like that. But this was a great, awesome return to form. I didn't know it was at the time, you know, it was just the new album that was out, but there's some ripping songs on this, and I still love it. Are You Ready? Are You Ready for a Good Time? You know, just classic, like, gravel-throated Brian Johnson, high energy guitars, rock and roll from the Razor's Edge. You know, I worship the shit out of that. And there's a bunch of releases and a bunch of albums that I don't own anymore. They didn't really hold up for me. You know, your taste changes as you get older. I hold on to a lot of stuff that I loved, and it doesn't really, for the most part, I don't stop liking something if it meant something to me at one point, but there's a few exceptions. I loved Faith No More. The Real Thing was out like maybe a year before. I think it came out in '89. Not really my favorite album anymore. It's not like I hate that band, but it's just, I don't know, just kind of its era, and doesn't really do anything for me anymore. Although Surprise You're Dead's a jam. I was really into Alice in Chains because it was the year that 1990 was the year that they toured with all the bands on the Clash of the Titans tour. Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth, and that video from Man in the Box was huge at the time, and I really liked that record, and there's still some jams off of that record that I still like, and I will thank Alice in Chains for me knowing who Black Sabbath were, because I read about them in interviews and was like, gotta check out this Black Sabbath band that's a huge influence on Alice in Chains, and the rest was history. My Sabbath period doesn't come for another couple of years when I got really doomy. And this is the actual skateboard I had at the time. I don't know if you can see this because it's just disgusting, but you can see I have Alice in Chains facelift right there. And I don't even know if it's readable, but that did say Faith No More. This originally was all clear, and it had other stuff on here, DRI and SOD and Anthrax. And I don't know if you can tell because it's just, like I said, dirty as hell. But that's the Motorhead 1916 thing that I cut out of the back of, like, I don't know, some magazine, probably Metal Maniacs, and put under the clear grip. I was a huge fan of that when it came out. We'll talk about that, or mention it at least. That wasn't until 91, so I had this probably the end of 91, 7th grade, and I don't know how this deck has stayed with me over the years. At one point I gave it to another skateboarder dude just for historical purposes, and he hung it up in his house, and he actually gave it back to me when I was like, yeah, you know, I think I'd like that back, just out of sentimentality. It is a Heinzman double kick. This is the first double kick skateboard that I owned on Gordon and Smith. Yeah, you can see I wrote Kill 'Em All on there and stuff, but it was like 2 ketchup bottles, you know. They had the whole symmetrical thing that was getting really popular with the two, you know, the nose and the tail being the same thing, and then, you know, after that it was all uniform, you know, the whole popsicle stick style of skateboards. So that's your history of skateboarding lesson. I thought that might be fun to include that. Now that I've been rambling for about 10 minutes, let's get into what I was into after AC/DC at the time. So going in 6th grade, you know, listen to the same stuff I mentioned in the last update. I was really getting into AC/DC, Alice in Chains. Faith No More was huge. I was also a big fan of Red Hot Chili Peppers' Mother's Milk. Again, not something that held up for me. What else? Band called Ludachrist. Or not Ludachrist, I always do this. Rather, Scatterbrain, who had members of Ludachrist. Scatterbrain were kind of a thrash metal band, but they had that kind of Red Hot Chili Peppers slap bass funk stuff all over everything. Not really a fan of that these days, but I still love. Ludachrist is awesome. Big fan of them. And I was into Suicidal Tendencies, who I would be showing off the records if I had the one that was a big deal for me at the time, which was Lights, Camera, Revolution. The music video for You Can't Bring Me Down, huge deal. You know, had like these guys that looked like gang members, but the music kind of sounded like Slayer, that had swearing and ranting all over it. To 12-year-old me, it was match made in heaven. And it was the first thing I ever heard by Suicidal on the Box Network, which was a request video channel where you could call in, and it showed up on your phone bill apparently. That's how it was paid for. I thought it was credit card, but John corrected me. My guest that was on a while ago, I think we talked about that. But yeah, loved about it, and I still do like about half of that Suicidal record, Lights, Camera, Revolution. There's some great West Coast thrash metal on it, but there's some funk bass on it too, where just slap bass, unless it's in actual real funk music, doesn't really hold water for me anymore. Sip of coffee. So, going into 7th grade, I was really into stuff that you would expect. My local record store had this little number. I picked that up. Ride the Lightning on Elektra. Not the first Metallica I'd ever heard. I had Injustice for All before that on cassette. Don't own it anymore. I really should. Completely baseless aspect of it notwithstanding, it's a great dark thrash record in my opinion. Yeah, I had Injustice for All and pretty much wore it out. Love the dark lyrics, like particularly Dyer's Eve. You know, that's the song to jam if you're not getting along with your parents. Like any other angsty preteen, I was not at the time. And then, you know, I went to Catholic school that year, so I was getting into Metallica, I was getting into Megadeth. So Far So Good, So What. This has Hook and Mouth, that was on that thrash metal comp that I discussed. Some generic Capitol Center labels there. And I liked these records, but the funny thing was is that I had a cheap record player, like one of those dual deals, combo deals that had a record player and tape. Didn't have CD on it yet. And they sounded like crap. I'm assuming it was probably some sort of ceramic needle or whatever. It definitely wasn't a Pro Gear, Pro Tude kind of setup. And I was like, man, records sound like shit. And I eventually just kind of glued these on my wall, used them as posters. I think I taped them and, you know, kind of moved on with my day. If I can find it, I think I have it on my Facebook. I have a pretty funny old picture of me in my old room where both of these are on the wall. These are not these aren't the originals that I had back in the day. I don't know what happened to those. It scattered to the four winds, you know. But, so that was like my basis for metal. Of course, I was already an Anthrax and Nuclear Assault fan. A few other things here and there that I can't really remember. And then, you know, Catholic school wasn't, you know, it was kind of the experience I think a lot of people have in middle school and in any kind of private schools where it's that age, everybody starts learning how to be a dickhead, you know. People seem like to be at their worst when they're entering their teens, at least according to a lot of people in my experience. But there was a couple of weirdos I was friends with. You know, we all had to wear ties and all that kind of shit. And a couple of kids that were into skateboarding and metal and punk and stuff. And a few significant releases came across my way. This guy Eric taped me Dead Kennedy's Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death. And I talked about this, but for sake of continuity, it's Dead Kennedy's singles collection. Lots of classics. Kicks off with Police Truck, Too Drunk to Fuck, California Uber Alles, Holiday in Cambodia, Buzz Bomb from Pasadena, the remake of Buzz Bomb with like the old lady voice, I Fought the Law, Saturday Night Holocaust, Pull My Strings. I'm not going to read off every song title, but Night of the Living Rednecks is a great one, the stage banter, where Jelly Opera goes on that funny rant, storytelling kind of thing where he talks about getting attacked by jocks in a giant-sized Hot Wheels car, who spray him with some water, call him the F-bomb, chase him into a phone booth, throws a rock at him at some point. Funny stuff. Nobody quite has the stage banter skills like Jello, but the music, you know, wiry, surfy, psychedelic in moments. When they're slow, it's real creepy. Not remotely metal, really, at all. I mean, the aggression might be somewhat, and all that, but it just wasn't like anything that I'd heard. I had Dead Kennedys, or I had Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks, that I bought because I saw it in Thrasher, and Megadeth covers Anarchy in the UK on here. And, you know, I heard that Sex Pistols record, and it sounded so flat to me and so limp, just because I'd been listening to thrash metal already. I learned to love it later, a couple years down the line. You also notice Dave Ellefson here has a Dead Kennedys sticker on his bass. So there's all that kind of connectivity. You know, I'm sure anybody who pays attention to any kind of media source about metal, or YouTubers or zines, like, it's been driven into the ground how we got into other bands from stuff like that. You know, I don't really need to reiterate it that much. I'm sure younger people are probably tired of fucking hearing it, but it's true. You know, that's one of the first times I'd heard of the Dead Kennedys. You know, this whole pre-internet era, you know, it was a thing, but whatever. Then this dude John dubbed me a cassette that had Speak English or Die on one side and AF's Live at CBGB's on the other. And interesting contrast, you know, between Dead Kennedys and SOD. You know, I wasn't the most politically minded person at age 12 or 13, but I could tell that they were coming from a little bit of a different perspective, you know, about the, you know, calling out to say the Pledge of Allegiance and everything, you know. It kind of just started getting me thinking about, you know, viewpoints and stuff like that. More importantly, the music kind of blew me away. You know, I gotten close to hearing a little bit more of that kind of whiplash tempoed hardcore punk, almost blasting sort of thing, with those 2 or 3 Nuclear Assault songs that were like Hang the Pope, that were basically like punk songs or whatever. But I hadn't heard entire records like that. I didn't know really about the whole connection with Dan Lilker yet. You know, that he was a member of Anthrax and Nuclear Assault, because cassettes those days often didn't have any liner notes, no information about the band, so I didn't learn that till a little bit later. Great starting point for Agnostic Front on here. I think a little bit later that year I saw the video for Anthem that was like live at CBGB's, In Effect Records, BT Dubs label that was pretty important back in the day. Had Sick of It All, had 24/7 Spies, Nuclear Assault, a couple that I can't remember off the top of my head right now. Harder Than You, Hollis Queens. But yeah, I like that AF video. Got me curious about like what hardcore was exactly, you know, what the difference was between hardcore and metal. I wasn't aware of like what crossover was. I knew that the two genres were somewhat separate and there was some bleed in between there. So, I mean, this was good starter pack stuff, you know. SOD, as far as Extremity goes, for their time, I mean, this came out in '85. I was getting into it around 1990. But the riff quality, the bordering on blasting stuff, courtesy of Charlie Benante, the sarcastic, offensive lyrics, you know, the kind of goofy comedy angle with like that What's That Noise song. I love that. Swearing, you know, you just love swearing when you're a kid, or at least I did in that era, just because I wanted to shock my parents or whatever. I don't think they really cared that much. So those two were huge for me. And then I got DRI's Thrash Zone, a band that, you know, one thing about a lot of these bands from these eras, especially the bands that go back to the early 80s with the punk movement, all these bands had these really iconic logos and mascots and what have you. I mean, the Dead Kennedys had that DK sort of thing, geometric sort of shape that looked like a DK. Black Flag had the bars, of course. We talked about COC and that radiation skull. And I'd seen this all over the place as early as 87 or 88 when I started buying Thrasher. And I also recognized it from one of my favorite movies, Gleaming the Cube, which, talk about stuff not really holding up. Oof, woof. Christian Slater, his adopted brother, is murdered, and at the end of the movie he decides that he has to clean up his act to somehow infiltrate. So he, you know, cuts his skater haircut into something normal, and he starts wearing preppy clothes, and he rips down his DRI poster from the wall. And I was like, well, I gotta check that band out, you know. if they don't make the cut for Christian Slater being normal. Then he somehow saves the fucking day by getting a metal skateboard built for him and like skating down a mountain. I don't know. That movie did not hold up. Thrashing, way better skateboarding flick. Anyway, I bought this at the mall. I think I was supposed to meet up with somebody and they stood me up, and I was just kind of like waiting for a ride for 2 hours, so I wandered around. Instead of seeing a movie, I bought this on cassette, and I had my little cheapy Walkman and spun the shit out of this. Wore out the tape, and it's, you know, it's good dumbed down, like kind of Bay Area thrash, I'd say, but there's not as much complexity. There's not as much in the way of solos. It's not a riff salad. It's more punk oriented. It's crossover. It's a sound that they'd been fostering for a couple albums at this point. Snotty vocals by Kurt Brecht. You know, reality-based lyrics. There's a pro-gun control song. There's songs about kids getting kidnapped. The song Thrash Hard is you know, a total goofy mosh pit anthem. You know, if you're familiar, you probably know the lyrics, like a wild Indian from outer space, drunk and high on weed. But there's some great riffs on it. I still spin it from time to time out of nostalgia. As years went on, I discovered the earlier stuff, which I'll probably talk about next update or soon, the more punk-oriented shit. And that stuff is really classic and really great, but I'll always have a soft spot for this, as well as the metal era Suicidal records. You know, a lot of purists don't like that shit, hardcore purists, but I think it's great. And this was also the year that 1990, the year that Seasons in the Abyss came out. That same channel, The Box, always played War Ensemble. Also, Headbangers Ball played War Ensemble pretty frequently. I don't know if it wasn't until 91 when the Seasons in the Abyss music video came out, when, you know, they're with the pyramids and all that kind of stuff. But both videos were great. Both completely changed my life. Probably for the worse, but maybe for the better. I still like this record a lot. Slayer, Seasons in the Abyss. So just a reissue on American there. It's like kind of like the Suicidal thing, where it's like half the songs I'm still pretty psyched on, and the other half I'm kind of like meh. But you can't fuck with Spirit in Black. War Ensemble, of course. Dead Skin Mask kind of hasn't held up. It's not as creepy as it used to be, although that little kid talking fucking weirds me out still. Born of Fire. That's a song that could fit on any classic Slayer record and still fit in perfectly. You could put that on Rain and Blood, you know. Yeah, it's a decent, solid record, but I definitely spun the shit out of it as a kid. It was a big lawn mowing one for me. The auto reverse on the Walkman, just, my dad had a huge like riding lawnmower and like 3 acres of fucking lawn, and I would just let it go and go and go. And I actually forgot one, so hold on. Hi, I've returned. This update needs a mention of Persistence of Time if we're talking about 1990 and stuff I got into off of MTV. There are so many videos for this record. It had so many singles. I think Keep It in the Family was one of them. In My World was one of them. Belly of the Beast was a huge one. Of course, the cover of Got the Time, which has been discussed. I mean, I just showed this off, but the first one I got into was Fistful of Metal, and it's kind of weird how this was the next one. Fistful of Metal was the hot one for me as an introduction, never hearing anything else. And then like a year or two later, I grabbed this because the videos were everywhere and the music's vastly different. Well, maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic using the word vastly, but the music was markedly different. Slower, more brooding, you know, less, yeah, metal kind of lyrics. You know, Scott Ian, I think, was writing the majority of the lyrics, and he was trying to get a little bit more cerebral and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I think it's an overlooked record nowadays. Like, it was huge when it came out. But people, when they talk about classic Anthrax material, usually talk about Among the Living or Spreading the Disease, you know, or even Fistful of Metal more, and kind of forget the majesty and fucking epic nature of this. I love this record. Very heavy. That song Discharge, the last song, is a face ripper, you know. The intro and Intro to Reality and the riff that going into Belly of the Beast is absolutely crushing. Belladonna's vocal performance on it's good, really good, you know. And it's after this, you know, Sound of White Noise would come out a couple years later, and I remember being massively disappointed by it because it sounded like a grunge record or something. Little did I know that John Bush was pretty much doing the exact same vocal style that he'd done since the early 80s with Armored Saint, and that actually the guys from like Alice in Chains and bands like that were inspired by him. And I hated that record when it came out, but I've revisited it recently, like the past couple of years, and I actually really dig it for what it is. But that's that for this update. That wraps up 1990, and I'm probably gonna go upload this and start on 91 immediately because it's my fucking vacation, and I've been wasting time. Tick 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 in my head.